Welcome to the Prof Talk Pod, brought to you by the Engaged Professor. Every 2 weeks, join us as we talk about tips and tricks to help you connect with your students, engage with industry, and stay up to date on all the teaching trends. We'll give you actionable strategies that will help improve your teaching today. Thank you for being here. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Becky Aiken, and I'm here with my friend and colleague, Dr. Galen Clavio. This week on the Prof Talk Pod, we're going to talk a little bit about some of our tendencies, maybe to sometimes complain about students and what maybe some of the negative or potential negative outcomes are of that. And this idea really came from a couple weeks ago when Galen and I were recording our podcast. We had just kind of offhandedly mentioned that sometimes when students come in asking for help on grades or understanding when they have a late assignment, that sometimes when as faculty, our automatic kind of perspective is to go to complaining with each other about, oh, the students this, oh, the students that. And it is something that, when I go to an academic conference and we're presenting our research, oftentimes conversations turn to students. And I hear a ton of, can you believe students these days ask for XYZ? Or this didn't work in class and it's just because these students these days won't do this or aren't interested in that or aren't trying very hard. And I've felt for the last few years especially that there's a lot of problems that come with that, focusing on the complaining aspect of it. And I wanted to talk a little bit just about maybe some of our experiences and how, for me, reframing my focus on when things don't work, not automatically going to the blame game, whether that's my self-blame or students, has actually been more productive. And especially as we think about connection with our students, I think, trying not to build barriers or negative perspectives between the two of us can be really important. So I know this is actually something, Galen, when we were talking, that you kind of mentioned offhanded. You're like, oh yeah, the complaining about the students. And I imagine in your role, when you have students and faculty who maybe have disagreements, you might hear kind of a lot of maybe that blame game. So I'd love to just hear kind of your experience or maybe an experience you've had with this.
Yeah, it's an interesting area for me because, first of all, I think you have to understand human psychology tends towards wanting to establish in groups and out groups. If you've done any work with social identity theory, you recognize this. And educators at any level, whether you're talking about elementary school or high school or college, you're naturally going to be surrounded by people whose sense of identity is as an educator. And so you need an out group, and the out group is always the students. And it becomes very easy, I think, to refer to students collectively as this monolith and to be concerned about them, or maybe concerned is actually the wrong word, but like it's easy to fall back on complaints. It's easy to fall back on, oh, the students this, students that. And I think it also dovetails with something else that you and I have talked about, which is the way that higher ed in the US is set up, particularly at larger scale institutions, which many of us teach at. Undergrads are like an underclass of student because a lot of people who have PhDs, their focus is supposed to be working with graduate students and doing research. And, whereas a lot of times you'll view your classes that you're teaching at the undergraduate level as a necessary evil, or something that you have to engage in, not something that you want to engage in. So really, and this is where I've been an oddball my whole career, because I enjoy working with undergrads, as I've talked about before. I enjoy the kind of developmental process that they go through as 18, 19-year-olds through being 21, 22 years old. And because of the programs that I've been involved in, I've been able in many cases to like work with students for 3 or 4 years, not just have them in a class and then have them disappear. So I guess I'll say, like, on the one hand, I oftentimes reject the complaints that a lot of people have about students, particularly when they're just collective complaints without a lot of real evidence behind them. But I'm also not here to say that there aren't things to complain about with students, because I know from talking with many colleagues, like I see a lot of the issues that there are. I just, my thing is always, I'm hesitant to try to complain about a whole group of people when in many cases it's just individuals acting badly.
Yeah, that's so my husband is an army recruiter and he'll always say young people these days. And I will always be like, well, first of all, when we were young people, people said literally the same thing about us, young people these days. And two, people are not a monolith. Like you said, students have a wide range of interests and reasons they're in college and things they want to do out of college. And the reason that I find it a little bit problematic or some negative things I've seen happen is something doesn't go well in class and you walk into your colleague's office when you get back and you say, the students just aren't willing to, step out of their comfort zone and engage in this activity with me. And I just have to keep pushing until and keep making them do it until they magically decide they're going to engage. And it does a couple of things. One, like I mentioned, it kind of puts a barrier, like you said, in group, out group between you and the students. And over the course of a semester, or even, if you teach multiple courses in the same program, that can grow to automatically when students walk in your door, there's no ability to connect with them because they've already gotten the vibe that you see them as lesser than or different, so different from you as the instructor that they can't connect.
Right.
And sometimes it also means that we don't sit down and actually think about maybe our approach to that activity or that assignment needs revising. It doesn't mean just because something doesn't work or students don't like it, you throw it out the window. But it may be that we didn't have them prepared enough to engage in that. We didn't intro it the same way. So instead of taking kind of that reflection based look at how we are working as a teacher, we automatically it's the student's fault. I'll just keep trying again. And that doesn't help our individual or professional growth. And in the long term, the pounding the square peg into the round hole, I've not seen that work ever. And so I think that that's some of the problems with it is that it really causes us to stop trying to grow ourselves because we just automatically blame game to the student.
Yeah, and look, a lot of this business of education at the college level, I think, is you fall into patterns based upon what is your incentive structure for getting promoted or getting tenure or whatever. And I mean, at most R1s, how you interact with students is not really that high on the list of priorities. A lot of times people are looking at their classes as something to get through on a semester by semester basis while they focus on the things that they are getting credit for, which is generally research productivity or in some minimal cases service. So it creates, I think, an unfortunate mix where for a lot of faculty, you do need, if you do, I've been in this business now for close to 20 years. And the way I teach now is different in some ways than how I taught at the beginning. And I've had to modify, this is essentially, I'm ending the second generation of students that I've taught. I started teaching purely millennials and we're purely Gen Z now, and we're already starting to hit that little bend, and we're going to start to see some Gen Alpha students come in, and that's going to require additional change. And I mean, I'll say right straight away, like my experiences teaching Gen Z students are very different from what my experiences were teaching millennials. And I think for most people who've been in the business for a while, they would acknowledge the same thing if they sat and thought about it. There are some approaches or some things that you can settle in on and say, this is how it needs to be done. But I do think that you have to consider constantly, like, how is this landing with the students? And a lot of it comes back to this thing that gets argued about a lot, which is, well, are the students in the traditional sense? Are they consumers? How do you balance those things? And I've got colleagues, and I'm sure you do, and there's people all over the country who are like, well, no, we know better what the students need than what they think. And there might be some instances where that's kind of true, but the modality, the methodology, the approach that you take in the classroom does matter. And I think falling back on the idea that the students don't know what they're doing. It's like that Simpsons meme with the principal, where he's like pondering some problem, and he says at the end, like, no, no, it's the children who are wrong. I kind of feel like that to some degree sums up a lot of the collective complaining that we see about students, because it's easier, as you said, to just say, well, I know what I'm doing because I've been doing this for years, and they don't know what they're doing because they're just in college. You have to make some adaptations. It doesn't mean it's always good. I mean, it's weird to be wistful for millennials, but millennials were a lot more focused in the classroom. I think they were a lot easier to get excited because they had kind of a more naturally optimistic worldview than Gen Zers have. But I've also been able to. I'm right in the middle of the two generations of millennial and Gen X, and I've been able to draw off of that. I think to be able to more effectively teach Gen Z because Gen Z is basically like a reskinned Gen X in a lot of ways, and that's just a different personality type. So, but I just to back it out a little bit larger, it's like the kinds of things you can do in the classroom that get people more engaged with the material. You have to be thinking about those things, and if you're not, and your default is, well, I'm doing this right, they're receiving it wrong, that is where I would say, like, pump the brakes a little bit. And if you're engaging in a lot of collective complaining with your colleagues, it doesn't necessarily mean you all are right. It just might mean that you're all a little bit out of phase.
One, most of us, again, we've talked about this before, weren't taught how to teach before we started teaching. And sometimes I think faculty generally forget that you are also supposed to continue to learn and grow, and the world is changing, and so must you. And, nothing is more made that more obvious than generative AI and how that's impacting the way we teach and the way students learn. But it was happening before that. The way students learn has been evolving always, and it's part of our job and not always told to us that it's part of our job, especially if we're going to teach, to consider how we can evolve a little bit. And I'm not even saying like there are definitely times where I am right and the students are definitely wrong and I need to keep doing what I'm doing. But that doesn't mean that I can't repackage what I'm doing
Right.
to meet the same goal in a way that actually has a positive impact on the classroom, and trying to remove that automatic assumption that it is in fact the students that are the problem and not something that I can control is really, really important. And this is probably a worldview thing for me. I have a graduate student who was a graduate student of mine at Illinois State, and now is a PhD student or a PhD, new PhD. And I always tell her, I was like, let's focus not on what's happening, but what we can do now that it has happened. And that's where that trap, I really want to help faculty to rethink, don't get so bogged down in complaining about what it's not working and whose fault it is, and try to think about what can we do to move forward to make the things that you need to have happen to reach your learning goals. And I'm not saying we should never complain because everybody needs an outlet. It's just that a culture, I think, of complaining where everybody in the department sits in a department meeting and you are walking through some ideas of how to improve the curriculum or assignments or get students engaged. If the whole table is spending an hour complaining about students, we just wasted a whole hour because that isn't going to get us anywhere. It's not going to move us forward. And so when we think about reframing this, when you automatically want to go to, it's the student's fault, it might help to stop, take a breath, and try to reframe the way that you approach it. So the whole department doesn't start to kind of devolve into that it's the student's fault. We'll just keep doing what we're doing. And maybe we'll get different students. Like the students are going to continue to evolve. And so our focus on blaming them isn't going to help us.
Well, and I always think about, like, so I teach in and administer in the media school. And one of the complaints you'll hear collectively about students is, well, students can't write. None of these students know how to write. And I'm always in the back of my head, I'm like, that's true because I also have them in class. But that's not their fault. That's the fault of the schooling that they got before they got here. And this is to some degree, I think, part of the problem with where higher ed's at now, and the way that secondary education has changed so much, where it's so test focused, it's so metrics focused. People, I'll hear people complain about, well, students can't critically think. It's like, well, they're not being asked to. And now you basically have inherited a student that's about 2 or 3 years back the trail than what you might have experienced if you started teaching 20 years ago. Complaining about it isn't going to help any, because you're not going to just, like, complaining isn't going to make the students write better. It does mean you have to change some approaches. Now, you can complain about the system that led to that, but I think it's unfair to a lot of students to simply be like they don't care, or they're not interested in learning. That's generally not true. Every time I hear that, I'm I mean, it's not to say that there aren't students out there whose motivation structure could stand to be better. I've taught, I mean, maybe this will be controversial for some of the folks that watch the show, but I've taught students in sport management who I've found to generally have, a very uneven motivational structure at times. Because a lot of times that ends up being for a certain segment of the student population, it's a degree you take because it looks easy on paper. And those tend to be students that are harder to deal with because they don't really understand why they're there or what they need to get out of it. I also teach media students who are the exact opposite. These are very highly motivated students who figure out very quickly that they have to be super motivated. They have to go out and do X, Y, and Z. Otherwise, they're going to get left behind. And, it's like my wife teaches in a business school, like a top ranked business school. They have almost over motivated students, which creates a separate set of problems. And the complaints that she has about her students and the complaints that I've had about like my former students are, it's like, how could these both though both these populations be in the same school? So even that's a little bit of an issue because again, it kind of goes back to, are the students your out group in your mind? And I feel like so much of what happens in the culture of higher ed leads you as a professor to think that they have to be, like that there has to be this adversarial relationship between you and the students. And I've, for one, never particularly bought into that. I understand many do, and I understand the rationale behind it. And I hear it in staff meetings or faculty meetings. I hear it in the way that people talk. And I don't know that you can necessarily change that, but I'd love to like reel that back in a little bit because especially as we move towards a far more student experience centric model of higher education, which feels like that's where most things are going right now, you're going to have to stop looking at the students as an obstacle and start looking at them as a group of people that you need to work with. And that if you work with them effectively, it can be a really rewarding relationship.
When I think some of the easiest, ways to do that is to use the word we when you start talking about your class on syllabus day. You get in the classroom, we are going on this learning journey together. This is not me opening up my knowledge and dumping it into your head. And that gives that kind of that feel of that it's a process and a journey and not just a me versus you. I think you're really hitting on one of the most important points is to really reframe that in group versus out group mentality. And while I'm certain that Galen, you and I are not the only two faculty that don't love the in-group, out-group mentality and try not to make it a me versus the students atmosphere. I'm certain there's thousands of other faculty who feel the same way. And honestly, it's probably something a little bit on us to try to have a positive impact on that culture when you feel that conversations are devolving into something that's maybe not productive and increasing that in-group, out-group atmosphere to be willing to speak up in those faculty meetings or even, I've had hallway discussions with a colleague and I've been like, I understand, I hear what you're saying. Other people have experienced that, I've experienced that, but what if we talk about it in this way? And that's really hard to do. And obviously, if you're a full professor, a lot easier to do in a big faculty meeting. But I think it's important to think about our ability to impact the way our colleagues think and interact, or at least try, because I don't know that we have another choice, as you said, as higher education shifts. The people who are willing to see students as a partner in the process are likely going to be able to have staying power and also not get out of higher ed because they get crotchety, which
Right.
is something I really don't want to have happen to myself. So I'm super in tune to try to not let it happen.
Yeah, ultimately, I think a lot of it is self-reflection, and it's tough. There's such a social reward in conversation for agreeing with what your colleagues are saying, and I think we all have to figure out, like, do I really agree with that, or am I just kind of laughing along because I feel like I'm obligated to? And some of the things. I mean, it really does come down to, I think, from a faculty perspective, you this is such a groupthink business, and you see it in what research gets published and what doesn't get published, and who gets invited to editorial boards and who gets opportunities internally in your departments or your schools. And you'll get a couple of people who get to a certain point in their career and they decide they're going to disagree with everything, and it's like those are the people who've decided to completely cross over. I get it, but as a younger faculty member, I think a lot of times these attitudes get calcified because of how consistent the students are dumb, students do things that are foolish, uh, students aren't committed to learning. That really can calcify in a person's brain very quickly, and you have no real incentive to think about it differently. In fact, you might feel like you'd lose opportunities potentially, or colleagues would think less of you as an intellect if you were focused on anything other than that and agreeing with the overall philosophy. And even though, I mean, and I'm sure many people watching this or listening to this are like, well, I don't really feel strongly one way or the other. But it goes back to what you were saying, where it's like you're kind of acceding at that point to whatever the loudest group think is, and it's just easy to fall into that pattern. And so I think talking about your students is fine, but rather than assuming the worst, it can be helpful to point out some good examples. Like, these students have really been engaged. This class has been great. And I hear, honestly, like, a lot of the complaints about students tend to come from tenure track faculty. A lot of the lecturers or the professors of practice that you hire who are working with students on time intensive projects or in upper level classes, a lot of them will rave about like how intelligent and how motivated and committed their students are. So again, I think that's another interesting thing. Some of it is just like, are you teaching 18 students at once, or are you teaching 200 students at once? That can have a big impact on your thought process as well.
Yeah, and I'm curious, you did say the point that you're not really incentivized to shift away from what might be the predominant thought in your faculty group. What if you had to make a suggestion to someone on something they could do? Do you have an idea of something that they could do, like a specific actionable thing that
Yeah,
they could do?
I mean, I think the first thing is when it starts in the classroom, and it starts with the interactions that you have with students, and it starts with how you're setting up the class and what kind of feedback, both verbal and nonverbal, that you're getting. And it really, I think, if you're interested in moderating your opinions a little bit because you feel like undergrads are out to get you or whatever, a lot of it, I think, is if you don't like the teaching evaluations, read them. Don't just take them personally, take them professionally. If people complain about certain things, I think you need to focus on those. Like, students aren't just being arbitrarily mean if they're being mean to you in evaluations. They're trying to give you feedback that might be helpful to you in making sure that the next class goes better. So I think a lot of it is self-reflection and the idea that you're going to have some ideas that don't work. You're going to have some things that were working that don't work anymore. You're going to have some things that you may think won't work for you because you have imposter syndrome, or you're in a position where you feel like you're going to be compromised if you're not don't have rigor in your grading, whatever that, like, nobody can ever define rigor for me, but so I think some of it is almost, the more confident you are in what you're doing, why you're doing it, if you've been able to write that out as a philosophy, if you understand what you're trying to do in the classroom, I think that does help this process, because then you no longer look at these students potentially as an adversarial body that you're fighting against. But instead, to some degree, you're looking at them as junior partners in an enterprise where everybody's getting evaluated based upon the feedback that comes out of the class experience. And that's a big leap for a lot of people, because they're like, God, I have to focus on this too with all the other things that I'm doing. But it's still part of your job as a faculty member. And I think it's better to go that way. And again, many people in the audience are probably doing that already, but it's better to go that way as a young faculty member and build that into the way that you approach interactions with students, rather than going in with not a clear sense of what you're doing, never changing it, and then getting mad when these 18, 19, 20-year olds don't react positively to things that may not have worked in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's a really good perspective. You mentioned that earlier, self-reflection is so much of this, and that's why it is really important to take time to reflect on a class at the end of a semester. Something that I recommend that faculty do is, write out a reflection on how the class went, what went well, what didn't, what students didn't like and did like. Again, not saying you're going to change it because they didn't like it, but in the moment, don't wait till next year when you're teaching the class because you will forget anything that happened the year before. and just write out some ideas for how you could move forward, because that's taking steps to improve versus getting really lost in the frustration. The other thing that last actionable step I want to mention probably will sound silly to some people, but for me, when I first started teaching, I created like a Word document where I just put out all my frustrations on paper to myself to try to avoid bringing those into bigger conversations. And then what that allowed me to do is look through that and be like, oh, I'm identifying these words or things that I'm saying. Those actually tell me something about what went wrong. So the way that I was talking about my frustrations about what the students did or didn't do actually gave me hints to what I might need to revise or reconsider.
Yeah.
Example, like, you know, everybody complained about their grade, but nobody turned in a draft, and I gave them all the opportunities possible to get feedback, and it's their fault that they didn't get feedback, and it's their fault that they didn't do well on the assignment. But did I adequately tell them about the draft opportunity? Did I build that into the grading process to put emphasis on the importance, if it really is that important? So there are things that that can tell you. And then oftentimes when we go back and look at something like that and we're not in the moment, we don't see it the same way, because as you said, we took the personal piece out of it. We took a step back. It's no longer about us because we don't feel attacked in the moment anymore.
Right.
And that really does change how we respond to it. Now, hopefully that helps over time. Like, I don't have to do that anymore because I've reframed my brain. I've trained it to not go that way first. But the other thing that that does is avoid the culture of student complaining so that you're not always telling your colleagues negative things. That doesn't mean you can never complain to a colleague, especially if it's something that you both think is, hilarious now, maybe wasn't at the time, because that there are our job can be a lot.
Right.
And it can be a lot to manage all these different emotions and perspectives on top of research and service, and constantly have to feel like we need to evolve. So sometimes we need to complain because we're humans,
Yeah.
and that's normal and fine. It's just a matter of recognizing ways that we can avoid making it only about that.
Well, and I just want to clarify also, I'm not saying students aren't ever wrong or that students should never be complained about. I mean, I've trust me, I've had plenty of students that have done things where I'm just like, why? What would you possibly what would make you think that was a good idea? I hear the same thing from other colleagues. And look, I think that you just have to flip your mentality. You're going to have students, particularly at the undergraduate level, but also at the graduate level, who just aren't going to do what they should be doing. And I think it's easy to just lean back on the idea that that's just students being students. And what I found oftentimes is those are the students that need the most teaching. Those are
Mhm.
the ones who need they need to be pulled aside and say, this is not right. What you're doing here is not appropriate or it's not going to help you. That's about all you can do. They may not listen, but again, I look at that as more of an individual item as opposed to a collective item. And the biggest advice I have is to just try to get out of that collective perception mentality, because it will lead you into spots where you take a problem that might exist amongst a small group of people. And if you think it's applying to everybody, it's going to significantly change, I think, in a negative way, how you approach dealing with students and being in the classroom.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to end it on. Is the goal is not to sometimes things are going to be negative in a very micro setting, but let's not take that out and make that be the truth across.
Yeah. You got it.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thanks for joining me to talk about this, Galen, and thanks everybody for listening or watching. Please go ahead and follow us on your favorite podcast platform or subscribe to the YouTube channel, and we will look forward to seeing you next time.